Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Citrus Bites, a budget special from our offices in Sevenoaks. Finally, we've made it to budget day. This has been days, weeks, months, the most talked about budget for years. The first budget to be delivered by a female chancellor, the first Labour budget in over 14 years. And the speculation has been rife. And I don't know about you, but frankly, I'm just pleased. We've got it over and done with. We understand what the changes are. So what I intend to do today is just canter through them at a very high level. You have probably seen an awful lot about them already. There's going to be a lot more to come in the days and weeks ahead. And on that point, my next goal is to speak to Jonathan Raymond, who's an investment manager at Quilter Cheviot. And I'm going to be speaking to him next week and raising a whole bunch of topics from things that have come out today, and also talking about the results of the US election. So if there are any questions you want me to put to Jonathan Raymond that maybe are things that you think are going to impact you following today's budget announcements, then please do send an email in to advice@citrusfinancial.co.uk. Don't worry if you haven't written that down. We'll pop it on the screen again towards the end. But please do send your questions in, and I'll do my very best to pose them to Jonathan next week. And that's one of the things about the budget. It impacts different people in different ways. So it's impossible to make a sweeping statement about who is impacted and who isn't. Clearly, a few really key points about today. So Rachel Reeves has stood up and said the government will rebuild Britain. There'll be no return to austerity and a pledge to invest, invest, invest. I am not going to make any political stance at all during this today. I'm just here to present the facts to you as they are. But she did make a pledge to put more pounds in people's pockets. And remember, this builds on the whole concept around kind of what the commitments were during the election, which is the commitment to exclude working people from the tax hikes. And as we know over the last few weeks, this whole concept of, well, who is a working person? So let's start with kind of what was talked about. There is a £22 billion black hole, apparently, made up of unfunded pledges by the Conservative government. I'm sure there would be a big disagreement from the Conservatives as to whether that is or isn't the case. And I think that the Office of Budget Responsibility, who you may or may not know, they tend to provide the feedback on the budget. They make comments, they validate kind of what the impact on the economy is due to be. I believe they haven't made a kind of formal statement over the position of the 22 billion black hole. There's been all sorts of announcements over what it's going to do to inflation, what it's going to be to growth. I think I'm not going to talk about those in detail today. What I would say about GDP, so growth in the UK economy over the next 5 years, and particularly real growth, it's fairly muted, I would think, would be. If you get excited by figures that start with a 1, then maybe it's great news. If you don't, it's probably less great news. But let's see how that maps out. There'll be lots more commentary to come in the days and weeks ahead. So let's start looking at what does it mean to people as individuals. First of all, personal taxes. So there was indeed no increase to personal taxes from an employee NI, VAT, or income tax perspective. There were no increases. And the government have confirmed that from 28 years, 2028 to 2029, they will update the personal tax thresholds on income tax and national insurance in line with inflation. So remember, these are tax thresholds that are currently being frozen for a few years. More and more people, this fiscal drag, more and more people being scooped into higher rate taxes because these thresholds are frozen. So from 28, 29, they will now increase in line with inflation. Capital gains tax is going to be increased. The lower rate is going to be increased from 10% to 18%, and the higher rate will rise from 20 to 24%. It's a really interesting one. Some of the figures talked about over the last few weeks have been a lot higher than that. So again, maybe there's some good news in there, albeit an increase in tax is very rarely a good news. For those of you not so familiar with it, it does remain the lowest of any G7 economy. And capital gains tax is, in its basic sense, is the charge on the profit from selling an asset that has increased in value. So such as stocks held outside of an ISA. So for those of you who are saying, well, what is this capital gains tax? There we go. That's a very brief description as to what it is. The other thing that's received a lot of commentary over the last few weeks is inheritance tax and whether more people will be scooped into inheritance tax. However, the government has announced they're going to extend a freeze on the threshold for inheritance tax, allowing that 325,000 to be inherited tax-free. That freeze on inherited tax thresholds is extended beyond 2028, which is the current commitment for the freeze, to 2030. Now, there are some other bits that might well impact in terms of inheritance tax. There's some reform reliefs for business and agricultural assets. And AIM inheritance tax relief has been cut in half. That's for investments in AIM market. Inheritance tax relief cut in half from 40% to 20%. So there are some changes there. Again, it depends, different things for different people as to who that's actually going to impact. But probably the biggest one that I've taken from today, inherited pensions are to face inheritance tax from 2027. So typically at the moment, they sit outside of an estate. That from 2027, they will face inheritance tax. Now, there might be lots of questions coming in on this one. I would say it's a very high-level piece of information that we know right now. Lots more detail to follow, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why that doesn't come in until 2027. So that's the inheritance tax. That's kind of the high level on the personal taxes. What about business taxes? So this is probably one of the biggest ones. So firms to pay national insurance on workers' earnings. So this is employer national insurance contributions. Earnings above 5,000 from April 2025, which is down from 9,100 currently. The rate will increase from 13.8% to 15%. And the employment allowance will be increased from 5,000 to 10,500, reducing national insurance for smaller businesses. So there is a little bit of an offset for some businesses there. But this one is quite a big hit from a business perspective. And by the end of the Parliament, Rachel Reeves believes this will bring in 25 billion. So this is a biggie. There are some benefits to other businesses. So they've announced they will introduce permanently lower business rates for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses from 2026, 2027. And until then, they will receive 40% relief on business rates up to a cap of 110,000. You may remember during COVID, some of these businesses got really heavily hit and are still actually struggling in some instances to rebuild. So a little bit of a commitment going through there. And the other one on business taxes as well, and perhaps for some individuals, but the concept of non-dom, as they're known, non-domicile residents will be abolished from April. That have been really widely talked about and perhaps not a surprise. The other one that have been really widely talked about and perhaps not a surprise, VAT on private school fees, that had already been kind of referenced as coming in January 2025. And the government are also going to introduce legislation to remove their business rates as well for private schools from April 2025. So definitely one there. Some of the other regular budget favourites that gets talked about, let's have a quick look at those. Transport, tobacco and alcohol. So on transport, I think this one had been highly referenced. A £2 cap on a single bus fare in England to rise to £3 from January, so quite a big increase potentially for bus fares. But the big one that I think had been talked about was almost inevitably being removed, but has been maintained, is the 5p cut to fuel duty. So this is a freeze that's been in for a while now that should have resulted in the fuel duty increasing, but this has been frozen at the reduced level. And actually, it's going to be kept for another year. There've been an awful lot of opinions that that will be abolished, particularly at a time where oil prices and therefore prices at the pumps are lower than they've been in some time. But the good news is that 5p cut to fuel duty, that's been extended for another year. For those of you that are flying regularly, or particularly for those of you that like to fly in a private jet, if you're fortunate to do so. So the government have announced air passenger duty is going to increase, so up to about £2 for European short-haul flights. And for private jets, for those that are traveling on a private jet, if you're fortunate enough to do so, that will attract an extra 50% air passenger duty. So a huge increase there, up to £450 per passenger for a flight. So there we go. That's the transport on tobacco and on alcohol. So sorry, tobacco increase of 2% above inflation and 10% above inflation for hand rolling tobacco, and also for vapes. So there's been a new tax introduced for vapes. So very much this ongoing view of determination to reduce the numbers of smoking, or indeed now vaping, in order to reduce the perceived impact on the NHS. And for alcohol, well, alcohol duty, amazingly, draft duty has been cut by 1.7%. So 1p off of a pint. So for those of you who like your pint, some good news there. But tax on non-draft alcoholic drinks will increase by the higher of the retail price index measure of inflation. So by RPI, so an increase there. Probably one of the last things, couple of things left for me to talk about today. One of those, you may have noticed if you've seen, I did a video literally last week talking about this. So stamp duty. And stamp duty, there's been an increase in the threshold for stamp duty for a while. That's meant that people trying to enter the housing market, that initial tranche, and for first-time buyers benefit from a raised threshold. So it's beneficial to them. They pay less stamp duty, or indeed in some cases no stamp duty at all. That finishes on the 31st of March, and there has been no announcement that that is going to be extended. So no extension announced to the current raised thresholds due to end on the 31st of March 2025. If you're not sure on that, have a quick look at the video. There was literally last week where it says, particularly if you're a first-time buyer, you ought to watch this video. What do I expect will happen? You know, there is quite possibly going to be a rush for those that have perhaps found a property or in the process of finding a property, particularly if they're first-time buyers who want to make sure they don't end up having to pay that stamp duty. Remember, there are lots of pledges from the government around investment into building a lot more properties. So that's one thing we expect to see moving forward, is the amount of properties being built and the determination to help many more people enter the housing market. And the other way that the government have announced they're going to do this is by increasing the stamp duty payable on second properties, which also applies to buy-to-lets and companies purchasing residential properties. There is an increase in the stamp duty there, from the initial rate of 3% up to an initial rate of 5%. And amazingly, that actually kicks in tomorrow. So from the 31st of October, for second properties, that increases immediately. So again, the view from the government is this will open up many more properties to first-time buyers. A few other bits and pieces then. Finally, wages. So legal minimum wage for both for over 18s, 18 to 20-year-olds, and for over 21s has been increased. And there's definitely a goal over the next few years to try and blend those into one minimum living wage. For carers, there's been some much more positive news over the eligibility is widened for the allowance to be paid to full-time carers by increasing the maximum earnings threshold from £151 to £195 a week. Benefits are also due to increase by 1.7%. And finally, for those from a pension perspective, triple lock, and I know it's a really important one for people receiving the state pension. Triple lock means pensions will rise by 4.1%. So this was followed by a whole range of topics around investment. And I think the biggest bit to take away is the commitment that the government really have no choice to follow up on, which is investment in the NHS. There will be a whole load following, no doubt, today on what that investment is going to look like. There was some more information shared today. I'm not going to go into it at this moment in time, but certainly from Labour's perspective, that really big awareness that having made that election pledge over the state of the NHS and what they're going to do to support the NHS, there's an awful lot of detail about the investment in the NHS and also wider public services, including for those that are absolutely sick and tired of potholes, more money to be spent on fixing the roads. So that's a really high-level overview of what's happened today. I think the big one I'd leave you with, if you haven't seen it, employers' national insurance contributions, that rise, and that one that's likely to raise, as they say, the forecast is 25 billion by the end of the Parliament. The changes within inheritance tax, particularly around that pension piece, being included in inheritance tax estates now from 2027. More details to follow on that. As I said earlier, please do email in. If you've got a question, having listened to this, having watched everything today, having reflected on it, you're worried about actually what might this mean for me, for pension, for my estate, drop an email in, advice@citrusfinancial.co.uk. Friday, after the US election, next Friday, I'll be video with Jonathan Raymond, investment manager at Quilter Cheviot. I'll do my very best to pose any questions that have come out from you over the budget, any questions that then follow with regards to the outcome from the US elections and the impact that has. In the meantime, from me, that's it for today. I'm glad we finally got that budget over and done with. Thanks for watching and look forward to seeing you soon. Until then, bye for now.